Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about bacteria, we have this pretty standard mental image, little microscopic blobs floating around, maybe on a petri dish.
Right, minding their own business until they cause trouble.
Exactly. But today, we are pulling an all-nighter, metaphorically, of course, to look at a family of bacteria that breaks, well, pretty much every rule in the book.
They really do. I mean, half the time they act more like viruses than bacteria.
We are cracking open Chapter 17 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology, 4th edition, and the subject is Chlamydia. Now, I have to ask why this chapter. Is it just because the name is famous for obvious reasons?
Well, the name recognition is definitely there, but if you're training for anything in the health field, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, this chapter is a non-negotiable hurdle.
Okay.
We aren't just talking about a common infection. We're talking about the single most common reportable infectious disease in the United States.
Wow, that is a massive title to hold.
It is. But the stakes go way beyond just the numbers. This family includes a leading cause of preventable blindness worldwide. It's a major cause of what we call atypical pneumonia.
And because it can be silent, I'm guessing?
Exactly. If you miss the diagnosis, the consequences for a patient can be devastating. We're talking permanent infertility, losing their sight. It's serious stuff.
Okay, so we definitely can't afford to skim this one.
Oh.
Our mission today is to treat this like a last-minute lecture. We're going to decode the weird physiology, visualize the life cycle, and break down the big three pathogens in this family.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's start with the biology. The text calls Chlamydia energy parasites. That sounds aggressive.
It's a perfect description, though. The first concept you have to lock in is that these are obligate intracellular parasites.
Obligate meaning they have no choice.
Exactly, no choice. Most bacteria are free-living. You give them some sugar and warmth, they'll grow on a table. Chlamydia cannot. They are biologically incapable of synthesizing their own ATP, the energy currency of the cell. They also can't regenerate NAD plus A, which is crucial for metabolism.
So they're just running on empty batteries.
Completely empty. They have to get inside a host cell, your cell, and literally steal your ATP to survive and replicate. They hijack the power plant.
That explains why they act like viruses, needing a host. But structurally, they are still bacteria, right? I'm looking at the description of the cell envelope, and it mentions 2 lipid bilayers. That sounds like a standard gram-negative bug.
It looks like one, yes. But there's a plot twist here that drives microbiologists crazy, and it's something the text calls the peptidoglycan mystery.
I love a good microbiology mystery. Peptidoglycan. That's the stuff that makes up the cell wall, right? The rigid mesh that holds a bacteria together.
Correct. For a long, long time, we thought Chlamydia didn't have any peptidoglycan at all because they don't have that rigid net-like sacculus structure that other bacteria have.
What?
But modern genetics showed us that they do have the genes to make it.
So they have the blueprints, but they don't build the house.
Sort of. They actually do produce it, but only at the specific point where the bacteria is dividing the division plane. They use it briefly, then they just stop.
Why does this matter for a medical student, though? Is this just, trivia?
Oh, it's critical for treatment.
Yeah.
Think about penicillin. Penicillin works by attacking the construction of that peptidoglycan wall.
Right.
Since chlamydia doesn't have a full wall, penicillin doesn't kill them effectively. The text notes that if you use those kinds of drugs, you just stress the bacteria out. They go into this persistent or chronic state, but they survive.
So you can't use penicillin to treat chlamydia. That is a huge clinical takeaway.
Huge. You have to use drugs that target something else. We'll get to that.
Okay, so we have a bacteria that steals energy and has a ghost cell wall. But the thing that really confuses people, including me, when I first saw this, is the life cycle. Figures 17.2 and 17.3 in the text show this loop, but there are 2 different things labeled chlamydia.
Ah, yes. The shape-shifting aspect. To master this chapter, you absolutely have to distinguish between the 2 forms. The elementary body and the reticulate body.
Let's paint the picture for everyone listening. Start with the elementary body, or the EB. What's that like?
Okay, picture the elementary body as a spore. It's tiny, it's dense, and it's tough. It's like it's wearing a suit of armor. This is the form that exists outside the cell.
So if I sneeze on someone or, transmit it other ways, the EB is what's traveling.
Yes, the EB is the infectious form. The text gives a great mnemonic. E is for elementary, but E is also for enter. Its only job is to survive, find a host cell, and get in.
Okay, so the EB knocks on the door and gets swallowed up by the cell. But usually when a cell eats a bacteria, it digests it. Why doesn't that happen here?
Because the EB is crafty. Once it's inside, it's sitting in this little bubble called a phagosome. Normally, the cell would fuse that bubble with a lysosome, which is like a bag of acid,
Right.
to dissolve it.
But it doesn't.
It blocks that fusion, it chemically prevents it, it basically creates a safe house inside the cell.
Okay, safe house established. Now what happens to our little armored soldier?
It takes off the armor. Within about 8 hours, that tiny, dark EB reorganizes into the second form, the reticulate body, or RB.
And what does the RB look like?
It's larger, squishier, and it's metabolically active. This is the version that starts stealing the ATP. This is the replicative form.
Ah, so R is for reticulate and R is for replicate. I like that.
Exactly. The RBs start dividing like crazy by binary fission. They multiply and multiply until that safe house, which we call the inclusion body, is absolutely packed. If you looked under a microscope, you'd see this massive colony pushing the cell's nucleus off to the side.
But they can't leave looking like that, right? They're too soft.
Right. If they left as RBs, they'd die instantly out in the world. So after about 48 hours, they start condensing back down, put the armor back on. They transform from RBs back into EBs.
And then the finale.
The finale is brutal. The host cell lyses, it just bursts open, and hundreds of new infectious elementary bodies flood out to infect the next batch of cells.
Enter, replicate, armor, up, burst. Wow. That is an incredibly efficient cycle for something that can't even make its own power.
It's evolutionary genius, really.
All right, now that we understand the machine, let's talk about the damage it causes. The text focuses heavily on the big three species. The first one is the heavyweight champion, Chlamydia trachomatis.
This is the most significant human pathogen in the group. And, the text splits it into 3 substories based on serotypes.
Right, I see that in figure 17.4. Let's take them one by one. First, serotypes A, B, B, and C. The text links these to trachoma.
Trachoma. This is primarily an eye disease. And we aren't talking about a little pink eye here. This is a chronic, rough inflammation of the conjunctiva.
And it's an ancient disease.
Ancient. The text mentions it's been found in Egyptian writings from like 3800 BC.
That is wild. So it's been blinding people for thousands of years. How does the blindness actually happen? Is the bacteria eating the eye?
Not directly. It's more tragic than that.
Yeah.
The repeated infections cause severe scarring on the inside of the eyelid. As that scar tissue contracts, it actually pulls the eyelid inward. Yeah, this turns your eyelashes inwards, so they constantly scratch your cornea every time you blink.
Oh.
It's agonizing.
Yeah.
And eventually, that mechanical scratching causes corneal opacity. It clouds over and you go blind.
So A, B, and C are for the eye. That's easy enough. Now let's move to the group everyone knows about. Serotypes D through K.
These are the genital infections. In men, it causes non-gonococcal urethritis, or NGU. In women, cervicitis.
The epidemiology chart in figure 17.6 is startling. There's this massive spike for young women aged 15 to 24. But here's the thing that's really scary. The text says most of them don't even know they have it.
That is the whole silent epidemic thing.
Yeah.
More than 50% of women with a D to K infection are asymptomatic. They have no pain, no discharge, nothing. So they didn't get treated.
But even if it's silent, it's not harmless, right?
Far from it. That's the danger. While it's sitting there untreated, the bacteria can ascend the reproductive tract. It moves from the cervix up into the uterus, the fallopian tubes. This causes pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID.
And that leads to scarring.
Yes, and if you scar the fallopian tubes, you block the path for the egg. This is a huge cause of infertility and ectopic pregnancy.
Wow.
And there's another victim in this DDK group too, the babies.
Right. Vertical transmission.
If a mom has an active infection during delivery, the baby is exposed in the birth canal. The text says roughly half of those infants will develop inclusion conjunctivitis, a really purulent, sticky eye infection.
And about 10% get pneumonia.
Yeah, the infant pneumonia syndrome. So if you see a newborn with a distinct staccato cough and an eye infection, you have to think chlamydia.
Okay, so D through K is genitals and boobies. Now the third group, serotypes L1, L2, and L3. This is lymphogranuloma venereum, or LGV. How is this one different?
The behavior is totally different. The DK group kind of stays in the mucosal lining. But the L serotypes are invasive. They invade the lymphatic system.
So they travel.
They travel to the lymph nodes, specifically in the groin. It starts with a small, painless bump you might not even notice. But weeks later, the lymph nodes swell up into these painful, tender masses called buboes.
And there's a specific physical sign the text highlights, the groove sign. Can you describe that for us?
Sure. Imagine the groin area where your leg meets your torso. You have the inguinal ligament running through there. If the lymph nodes above and below that ligament swell up, the ligament itself stays tight. It creates this visible depression or a groove between the swollen masses.
So if you see that groove, it's a classic sign of LGV.
Exactly. And it's important to note this is reemerging, particularly in men who have sex with men, often alongside HIV.
All right, that covers C. trachomatis. But before we leave it, let's talk about how to catch it and how to kill it. The text has a very specific warning about diagnosis. Do not use a gram stain.
Please, do not do it.
Why not? I thought gram stains were the first step for everything.
2 reasons. 1, remember that ghost wall? They just don't stain well. 2, they are intracellular. They're tiny and hiding inside your cells. You simply won't see them on a standard smear.
So what do we use?
The gold standard is NANHAS nucleic acid amplification tests. It's like a PCR. You look for the DNA, it's incredibly sensitive and specific, and you can run it on urine or a swab.
There is one old school trick mentioned, though, involving iodine.
Yes, this is a cool little differentiator. The inclusion bodies of C. trachomatis specifically contain glycogen. And as we know from basic chem, glycogen stains with iodine.
But the others don't.
The other chlamydia do not do this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you stain a sample with iodine and you see these little brown inclusions, you've caught trachomatis.
Nice little detective tip. Now, treatment. We established penicillin is a no-go, so what's the weapon of choice?
We have to target something the bacteria does make. They still have to synthesize proteins to build those EBs.
Right.
So we target the ribosomes.
So protein synthesis inhibitors.
Right. The go-to drugs are azithromycin or doxycycline.
Any caveats there?
Doxycycline is a tetracycline. You generally avoid those in pregnant women and young kids because they can affect teeth and bone growth. In those cases, the text recommends erythromycin.
And I noticed a note about co-infection. It seems like chlamydia rarely travels alone.
It's the buddy system. Chlamydia and gonorrhea are partners in crime. They are co-infected in a huge percentage of cases. So clinical best practice and standard for exams is if you find one, you assume the other is there too.
So you treat for both. You give the azithromycin for chlamydia, and you add ceftriaxone for gonorrhea.
Better safe than sorry. Absolutely.
Okay, we've thoroughly unpacked C. trachomatis. But the chapter wraps up with part 5, dealing with the other Chlamydiae, the respiratory ones.
Right, and just a quick nomenclature check. You might see these written as Chlamydophila. The text notes this was a proposed name change, but Chlamydia is still widely used, so don't let the names throw you.
Got it. Let's start with Chlamydia psittaci. This is parrot fever.
Psittacosis, yep. This is a zoonotic disease, so it jumps from animals to humans. In this case, birds, parrots, poultry, turkeys.
And how do you catch it?
You catch it by inhaling dust from dried bird feces or respiratory secretions. It's mostly in occupational hazard vets, zookeepers, poultry plant workers.
Okay, so the clinical picture. It causes pneumonia, but lots of things cause pneumonia. What's the clue that screams psittacosis?
It's the combination of symptoms. You get the fever, the dry cough, the atypical pneumonia, but you also get systemic signs, specifically an enlarged splenomegaly, or sometimes an enlarged liver.
Okay, that is distinct. So if I have a patient with pneumonia and a massive spleen and they happen to work at a pet store.
You test for psittaci. That's your top differential.
Got it. And the last one on our list, chlamydia pneumonia.
This one is strictly human to human, no birds required. It spreads just like the common cold via respiratory droplets.
Is it rare?
Not at all. The text says 50% of adults have antibodies to it, which means half of us have probably had it and just thought it was a bad cold or mild bronchitis. It's a very common cause of walking pneumonia.
There is an interesting, slightly controversial note at the end of the chapter linking this bacteria to heart disease.
Yeah, atherosclerosis. Researchers have found C. pneumonia inside the plaques that clog arteries. There is a statistical association between the infection and heart disease and even asthma.
Does that mean the bacteria causes the heart attack?
That hasn't been proven. Could just be a bystander. But it's a fascinating area of research showing that these infections might have long-term consequences we just don't fully understand yet.
It really highlights how complex the host-pathogen relationship is.
Okay, we have covered a ton of ground. We've gone from ATP theft to eyelids turning inside out. Let's bring this deep dive in for a landing with a recap.
Let's simplify it back down.
If I'm a student walking into an exam, what are the absolute must-knows?
First, the biology. They are obligate intracellular parasites. They can't make ATP. Second, the life cycle. The elementary body enters, and the reticulate body replicates.
Third, the big 3 pathogens. C. trachomatis is the versatile one. Eyes, trachoma, genitals, silent PID, and lymph nodes, LGV groove sign.
Then you have C. psittaci from birds. Remember, pneumonia plus spleen.
And C. pneumonia, the common human respiratory bug.
And for treatment?
No penicillin. Use azithromycin or doxycycline to hit the ribosomes. And always check for gonorrhea.
Perfect. Before we sign off, I want to go back to that ghost wall concept you mentioned earlier. It's stuck in my head.
It's the most lingering question for me, too. I mean, think about the evolutionary path of this organism. It has the genes to build a cell wall. It builds the precursor blocks. It even starts to build it when it divides. But it never finishes the job.
And yet it's still affected by drugs that target the wall.
It still carries the baggage of that evolutionary history. It gets stressed out by penicillin even though the drug shouldn't really hurt it.
It's like it can't quite let go of its past as a free-living bacteria.
Exactly. It suggests that even though we know the mechanics, we still have so much to learn about why these ancient parasites evolved the way they did. They're minimized, streamlined, and yet they're carrying these genetic echoes.
A philosophical ending to a microbiological journey. That wraps up our last-minute lecture on chlamydia. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of your study session today.
Keep questioning the text and keep connecting those dots.
Good luck with your studies, everyone. We'll see you on the next deep dive.